Okay, we're recording. Rami, this is episode 2. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you doing?
As I told you offline, I'll tell you again, and I'll say it from here to the end of the world. Um, a little bit miffed with a first world problem. My New York Jets find ways to win games that they shouldn't and lose games that they should win. And now are, instead of focusing on the future, are for some reason feeling like if they end up 6-10 or 7-10, they've actually accomplished something, which is not true. They've really accomplished very little. As I told you earlier, also that it tempers the joy of the Mets signing Juan Soto last week, which also, admittedly, as a skeptic, won't lead to any World Championships either. But at least it was exciting for something in December as it relates to baseball. You have the same vibe with respect to baseball as a Pirates fan, but at least your Steelers are good, so that's something.
My Steelers are good. I'm a little bit more pessimistic about my baseball team than I think you are about yours. But yes, my football team has been playing well up until this past weekend. We're taking the long view in Pittsburgh, all right? It's
Okay, good. And then, of course, you celebrated with your family a very important event. Why don't you share a little bit?
I did. My son celebrated his bar mitzvah last week, turned 13, and entered the tribe, as they say. So
Yeah.
it was a really nice celebration. Can't, especially during these times, just always looking for reasons to celebrate and dance and sing, and it was a good time.
Had he did he perform? Did he read from the Torah?
He read from the Torah. He did amazingly, and most importantly, this really is the most important thing. Is he turned to us right afterward and said, "When can I do it again?" So that is the pretty much all you can ask for as a parent. That he had a good experience doing it, and made us very proud.
Yeah, that is not usually the reaction of the 13-year-old boy in that space. Is like, okay, one and done, get me out of here, I'm finished. And thankfully, there were no mistakes and no one booed or threw anything at me, or maybe they did. But usually, if it goes well and it was a positive experience, then that does have, I mean, it can have good long-term impact as opposed to the opposite, which can be traumatic and a disaster. So,
For sure. I can only wish that I had the confidence that he has. I wish I had that when I was 13. I certainly did not. So good for him.
I hear that. No, yeah, I hear that. My boys thankfully did well as well, and I told you too that if nothing else, it proves that their teacher was good because I was their teacher. Reflects well on the teacher as much as on the student. But I'm glad it was a good experience for him because I have seen situations where that has not gone well for a kid at that age, and it has repercussions. And it shouldn't have been the case from the beginning, and they should have avoided it from the start, and they didn't. Parents just either weren't paying attention or not aware, and instead of really doing what would be best for the kid at that space and having a really good experience, it was a disaster.
Luckily, that was not the case for my boy. So I'm happy he had a good experience.
And the other siblings enjoyed it too.
Yeah, the other siblings enjoyed it as well. They steal the attention every chance they get, so they found their ways.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad that was a good experience, and continued opportunities to celebrate. And I'll tip my glass of coffee to you for that, and away we go.
Yeah.
Okay, technical matter there. Stopping. Sorry about that. Okay, so good start. I'm happy for him. I'm glad it was good. I'm glad that he is excited about the opportunity to do it again. Our topic this week, and maybe next time also, is end of year giving. And I've termed it, why is this giving season different than all other giving seasons? For obvious reasons in terms of that title, people getting the reference. And this is like high season for not all people in nonprofits and fundraising space, but like for the most part, this is a big deal for a lot of reasons. Historically, a lot of reasons, contemporarily, a lot of reasons. And I thought we could spend some time getting into just the whole meat of end of year giving. So I'll start it off for you with a question. Not the title question, because that could lead to more questions, but more like, so sort of what makes end of year giving or year end giving unique compared to other giving seasons, compared to Q1, or even just what just took place we talked about a couple weeks ago with Giving Tuesday. Like, sort of get me into it from your perspective, your years of expertise on the subject. What's special, unique, more about this than anything else?
So the way that I think about this is interesting from the sense of you can do all of your logic. You can put as much logic to things as you want. You can map out what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. The most important detail when it comes to selling anything or fundraising or whatever we're marketing here is, what is reality? What do people on the ground, what do your end users, your consumers actually do? What is their actual activity? And so we can definitely unpack the why of why is the end of year such a time for fundraising. But the most important detail is that is a time of tremendous amount of fundraising. Like, that you have to accept that as a given. The statistic that I think is most widely thrown out is something like 30% of all online gifts come through in the month of December. So that has to be your starting point. And I think it is interesting to peel it back and understand why that is. But the bottom line is that this is when people give. A lot of times people are waiting to make their charitable contributions until the end of the year. A lot of times people are just inspired by it. It's a chicken and the egg situation, because now you have organizations that are really on the train of end of year giving.
Right.
And
right.
So there's more asks, but therefore there's many more yeses than throughout the course of the year as well. And that's where I think we have to start from.
Really, like the why of it historically, or the emotional side of it, right, in reality, is less crucial than the fact that simply that's when people, it's like you're not going to avoid it because so many people are doing it. It's the exact opposite kind of a thing. I think you told me that about marketing around, what was it, selling shoes in certain places. I don't remember the exact anecdote, but the idea as to when you do something and when you don't do something. So people don't fundraise in the summer because people don't fundraise in the summer. And maybe you should fundraise in the summer because people don't fundraise in the summer. Right. So the fact that, like, I've been reading about it a little bit, like the history of end of year giving initially was driven by two factors: fiscal year for organizations, just in how they look at their math, and tax deductions. Which made the end of the calendar year meaningful from a giving perspective. I have a whole rant on why that's not true really anymore for most givers, but different time, maybe save it for next time. But the reality of what you said is that this is when people fundraise and this is when they ask. And so effectively, if you're in an organization, then you have to ask now too.
Yeah. I would say that you have to ask now too. I don't think that this has to be your flagship campaign for the course of the year. I think you should just be cognizant that this is a time of deep giving. So if you are tied to a different calendar cycle, if your fiscal year ends in the summer, or you want to fundraise more over the course of holidays that take place over the course of the year and not in December, I think that's totally fine. I think would be a little bit of a missed opportunity to not sort of plant your flag and say, hey, donors, I'm here also. There's great need for the people that we serve as well. Please donate. I think that would be a missed opportunity for a lot of organizations. That's sort of the way that I think about it.
Are there strategies then, like in terms of just on that point, let's say you're on a different cadence during the course of the year with it, but you still want to participate. Are you then looking at a subset of your organizational giving? Are you looking at a specific, maybe even niche kind of campaign that you might want to do end of year because you know that your big moments are going to be in March, April, let's say? And then are you differentiating? And I want to like hit on the point of the differentiating between end of year versus Giving Tuesday, like in terms of who the audience is for each of those things. Because I know a lot of organizations, and you and I used to do these campaigns together, they're just going for everybody at the end of the year. And there was a mass rush to do, online giving campaigns, 24 hours, whatever those things were, a lot of them. And everyone's on some level feeling like they're competing with each other. But then you find like one or two here and there that were really smart about like slimming that down into either a niche audience or a niche project, or a very small goal, or they were looking at a different set of metrics that they were trying to approach here. Like, sort of unpack that. That would help.
So I find that question hard to answer because in my experience, nonprofits, organizations are so diverse from one another when it comes to their ability to segment, their ability to target different audiences. I find that it's very hard to throw a blanket and say, this is what you should do. I can tell you what best practices are. Best practices are certainly to segment and to be aware of who you are asking and what you are asking of them, and to make a strategy for each specific donor. I know that's a super ideal, an ideal world that we're talking about, but you want to be able to individualize this, that different audiences and different segments are receiving very specific pieces of communication and their strategy behind each of it. One of the things that you did say as you were asking that question that really did speak to me, though, is I think that you can target specific projects and specific needs. That, to me, I think doesn't take a whole lot, a tremendous amount of resources from an organization to focus in and say, okay, for this campaign, for this end of year campaign, we're going to focus on this need or this project. That, to me, definitely speaks to me because that level of specificity, I think, really brings out a lot of generosity of donors. But to answer your question, in an ideal world, yes, organizations should be segmenting their audiences and not throwing everything to everyone. But I know that that's really hard. That's a really heavy lift, right. And not every organization has the resources to do that.
Can you share like an example of an organization that sort of niches down a little bit or picks out a sub? I mean, I can think of like one offhand from our experience, but any that come to mind to you that sort of do that? Because I think that's a good way to go. The other thing to think about when people do is just to get people to give again during the course of the year. And you really don't care so much about, I mean, you care, but you care less about what it exactly is that they're giving to, just that they open their pockets a second time in a calendar year for you, I think is maybe the bigger get than the specific project program because of, again, all the metrics, all the data around getting a new giver or someone to give more than one time during the course of the year. Any examples from your mind?
Nothing specific is jumping to mind of organizations that have done an end of year campaign that is specific to an audience or a subset within their donors.
Yeah.
That to me is, nothing is jumping to mind there. I'm sure that I've come across organizations that have that level of sophistication, but that would be hard unless we're talking about the exact example that you gave, which is to get donors to give again, which is a really interesting topic because from what I've seen, a lot of organizations are reluctant to go after donors that have already given in a calendar year. And that is short-sighted. That is not the best practice to sort of say, okay, Benny gave to my organization, therefore I'm not going to ask him again until we turn the page to January. The data would tell you that is not best practice, that it's really significantly easier to go to Benny again and say, Benny, would you give again? Recognize that this person gave in the past, but then ask them to give again. And I think that's a tremendous way to use this end of year time to say it's not too late for you to get that tax deductible gift to our organization or another tax deductible gift to our organization, as the case may be.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll give you the example I was thinking of. There's a school that we both know in the Baltimore area that does a major campaign.
Yep, I know exactly.
In May.
That's a great example.
I don't know if I want to mention them specifically by name, but they do the major campaign in May, around May, June. They do a really large campaign in May time, right? Matching campaign, ambassadors, the whole peer-to-peer thing. They raise a lot of money in that campaign, and they're massively successful. Then, I think 3 years ago, the executive there leaned into the end of year trying to get people to give again. But he knew that he got those people to give their big gifts at that time of the year. And so he leaned into a specific project that benefits from the major campaign, but is really a sub-audience of his parent body, student body, and made that the end of year campaign. And so he was able to shine the light on that group of people, specifically at this time of the year. He was able to give those people unique space to be public, seen, all that other stuff. And as a related thing, he was able to get people to give again because they were giving to something specific within the institution rather than, the institution itself. And it's been, I think, I would say, if you asked him, phenomenally successful move. And he then taps in, by extension, into the idea of the data of people giving more than one time during the course of the year and feeling good about it because it's not the same institution. It's a different thing within the institution. And if it's an ambassador-based kind of thing, I'm giving to my neighbor whose kid is in that program or whatever it is. And I think that's been incredibly successful for him.
Yeah, that's a really good example. It's a really good example. I want to point out something that you did not say, which is that you did not say the need to give was not because it's the end of year. It's almost like he strategically chose the end of year in December to run this second campaign. But in the messaging, the reason why he was going to create this campaign was not because it's the end of year and this is when you're supposed to fundraise. He found a need within that school. And he, as you said, he was able to shine a spotlight on it. And I think that's a really strong point also.
Yeah, he's just sort of using the timeline to his benefit. If it was and this is maybe something I'm super interested in, generally speaking, if it was a different setup, he would just do it at a different time, and get the benefit of it at that other time of the year. If that made more sense, it's just sort of, this is like, it's sitting there. Like, what are you going to do? And I've been asked this question by organizations. Okay, it's like you're telling me to ask people again. What am I asking for the second time? And I always say, like, maybe you have like a side project or something that you really wanted to do that you've been putting off for a whole host of reasons that you could now spin up for end of year, and people don't feel like they're giving the same thing again.
Correct. I would say that is what this executive director did is an easily replicable best practice, which is that just because it's the end of year and just because everyone is running campaigns now, the basic principles of fundraising, of demonstrating the need and demonstrating the solution, still apply. We're not going to throw those out and just focus on the time of year, which I've seen a lot of fundraising do around now. You can, which isn't to say that you shouldn't mention it and you can't use it as a sense of urgency or immediacy that we really want to get your gift by December 31st for your sake, so you get that tax deduction in this calendar year. There's no problem with mentioning that, bringing it up, underlining it, but it can't be the main focal point of your message. The main focal point of your message has nothing to do with the end of year. It still has to do with the fact that there are service recipients that are in need or to be service recipients that don't have the resources that they need right now. And because of your gift, Mr. or Mrs. Donor, these service recipients are going to get those services. That still has to be the main focal point of any messaging.
Right. I had a conversation with somebody around Giving Tuesday who asked me about, and you and I talked a little bit about it, but also the same thing about messaging towards the amount of money to be raised or messaging towards a specific giving day kind of a thing, rather than the actual story that or the need that's there. I guess in that sense, then it's not different than really any time that you're trying to ask for a donation in terms of how you're telling that story. Maybe you're angling it slightly differently, but generally speaking, the story is still what speaks, the need is still what speaks, and not the timing of the ask.
The timing helps because donors, at least theoretically, I was interested to hear what you had to say at the top of this conversation, that you don't feel that this is so true anymore, but at least theoretically donors feel that sense of urgency, like, oh, I really want to get that tax write-off for this calendar year, so it is in my best interest as a donor to write this check, or click the donate button, whatever your medium is going to be, to do that now. And I think playing upon that is totally fine. It's totally fine.
Yeah.
It's what doesn't happen. I don't think there's been that tipping point with Giving Tuesday yet, that if you would see that there were all of these donors and everyone gave on Giving Tuesday, then I would feel the same way. Like, then appeal to that. I happen to not feel that
Right.
Giving Tuesday has hit that tipping point in the same way. Excuse me. That the end of December has. But if it were to be the case, then yeah, you could run your big campaign then as well.
Right. They haven't made Giving Tuesday Prime Day for giving to that degree where people feel like the need or the urge to shop at a high level, where it overwhelms some other day. Like, the way I think about it is like Prime Day for Amazon, just for people not paying attention, that day they sort of made up in the summer as a day for people to shop. And that's the day that they have a lot of good offers and and a lot of good discounts. And it worked. I mean, for them, right? So much so that I feel like other sale days have disappeared, like Memorial Day weekend, July 4th weekend, have sort of been subsumed under Prime Day, because like you're not going to compete with that anymore, and so you don't. Giving Tuesday was sort of, I felt like, was moving in that direction, and it hasn't gotten there, and maybe it's not intended. That strategically they're not looking to overwhelm end of December. I'm not sure why. So, but very much feel like that's sort of the energy around it, is that it's reached a certain place. It's done a lot of good things that day, which we talked about last time. But the idea that it's going to take the lead as the single greatest day of giving in the year, I don't think it even is that, is not the case and not true, and does not appear to be a strategic initiative for what they're trying to do there.
I would think that if they tried to go up against December 30th or December 31st, which I'm guessing, I don't know this, but I'm guessing that one of those 2 days is the biggest giving day of the year. I think they'd lose.
By far.
I think they'd lose, right? Giving Tuesday would lose to go up against them in that battle if that was their aim. And the reason is that it's really hard to change consumer behavior, or donor behavior in this case. Like, as much as organizations may want to do that, the fact of the matter is that donors give during this time. And it brings me back to the conversation you and I had about Giving Tuesday, because it is totally, it's bottom up, right? It's donors, it's people who are creating those habits for themselves, and then collectively, this is like sort of collectively the habits that we have put ourselves into, as opposed to what's happening on Giving Tuesday, which is really top down. It's organizations saying, this is when we want you to give, but it's really, really hard to change behavior in this sort of way en masse.
Yeah, it's a question I was going to ask you, was about the trained behavior of end of December giving, when, as I mentioned it only just sort of passingly, but when the actual tax benefit that used to exist, for the most part, does no longer exists, and people still give then, and they give it on the idea that it's December 31st. I got to get it in for the tax deduction. Here's the short rant. Okay, before 2017, this is me getting like accountancy / fundraising at the same time.
I love it, because I have no idea what you're about to say. I feel like I'm about to get a whole education here. This is great.
Before 2017, the way people did their taxes was they had a choice between a standardized deduction and itemized deductions on their expenses, depending on what those expenses were, right? One of the things that people used to itemize was charitable donations. So they would get those receipts, and they'd collect those receipts, and they'd hold on to those receipts, and then they'd give them to their accountant, and then they would add them up, and that would be a deduction on taxable income for charitable giving, right? 2017, during the first Trump presidency, they changed the tax laws, and they increased the standard deduction by a certain amount of money, right? Such that for most people now, they no longer itemize their deductions, right? So they're just taking the standard deduction that the government is giving them for whatever the reason is, or however that works, and therefore they're no longer itemizing anymore. because that's true, their charitable receipts are worthless. They don't have any value in the sense that it's not reducing your taxable income, it's reducing your income because you're giving it, which goes back to your question from last time about why people give. Maybe they'll give less now that they know that this is true. But so the reality of that tax deduction thing, people still say it, and they probably shouldn't, because it's really not accurate any longer, except for a certain very small percentage of citizenry, at least in the US, who exist above a certain threshold, who are giving a certain amount of money over and above the standard deduction amount on an annual basis, which is more than most people give in an annual giving year. Mm-hmm. Right? The only thing that remains, and I'm not sure it's still true for 2024, was that Congress had passed the idea of a very small sort of universal deduction that had that was separate from itemized. So it just sort of existed for everybody at a threshold of, I think initially was $300, and it's like now it's $600, whatever it is. A lot of people fit into that category. Maybe they're getting that benefit. And if that's true, people should say that that's the benefit that they're accruing to. But for someone who's giving, a couple $1,000s a year, $5,000 a year, more than that a year in charitable deductions, first of all, for giving that amount of money, and hopefully you're giving it to good causes, you're not getting that benefit anymore. However, the residue of that reality is that they've habituated in an incredible amount of giving for this time of the year based on partially on that factor, right? So if they decided that it's a different time of the year, it would move. So in other countries, I think in the UK, I think it's the end of March or maybe it's April, where that sort of kind of like line exists as to how you chop up to get the charitable giving year. And so the behaviors are different. December 31st doesn't mean anything there. Where we are both located right now, December 31st from a giving perspective doesn't mean anything. And giving in general, the way it's structured where we are, is also different from the first place. That taxable deductions is not a thing. It's simply just how much of the money is actually given and how much you get back as a sort of like a rebate. It's like a whole other complicated mess. So as I said, like that was the reason. It was a good idea, short of them instituting some sort of a universal deduction, which I'm super curious if they did, how that would affect giving. I've been doing research on the subject now to write a very geek focused a piece on this, and I've been talking for a long time. But this is sort of how the interesting thing is it had habituated a certain amount of giving, separate from what I mentioned before, of the calendar year, fiscal year, holiday season, which I think is also, I didn't mention that before, that's a very much a factor in the US, is the holiday season at the end of December, whether that's Christmas or it's Hanukkah or what have you, holidays, high giving season, right? And so it's like, those things. And then the last thing is if someone gives a lot of charity to people like on the street or people who come to their door, they're not writing big checks. They're giving out small cash amounts, which are not deductible anywhere other than maybe in heaven, right? And so it doesn't actually apply in any space other than that it accrues to your good nature. But again, that's my long rant on the subject. And now maybe I've taught you something that you didn't know before.
I learned a whole lot in these last couple of minutes. Do you know, a bunch of questions come up for me, but for some reason, the one that is the forefront of my mind is, do you know what the giving calendar looks like in a place like the UK? Like, does giving spike in whatever you said, right before the end of March, right before the beginning of March?
It does a little bit there because people are cognizant of it in that way, in the same way that people were in the US, let's say before, or they think they are. Like I'll give you an example. I was working with the client recently. They were looking to do an end of year campaign, and they were talking about where their donors are located. And they talked about donors in the US, and donors in Canada, donors in the UK, other countries in Europe, in Israel. And they were very aware of this tax deductibility factor. And I gave them this little presentation that I just shared with everybody here now. And they're like, so we shouldn't do the campaign now? I'm like, no. I'm like, I felt like I told them two things. I said, I wanted you to understand what's true and not true about this time of the year in that way, so that you don't use it. Like, I don't want them to use tax deductibility as a thing. It's not a thing. Don't use it. That's not the way to go about it. And if it does affect how you think about it, because maybe I didn't know them at the time, maybe you don't have that many donors in the U.S., and therefore you're prioritizing a different economy, and then you want to change your timeline. So then I want you to be mindful of that factor, or appreciate that maybe in that specific community location, you want to run a unique, special, specific campaign for their quote unquote end of year giving, which is not the end of the calendar year, just an end of a fiscal year. That's a different thing altogether. And so they were appreciative of that. They decided that their largest base was US, and so therefore they were going to do this anyway now. But I wanted them to appreciate that whole tax deduction thing, which people still use and sell, which I really don't like, for the most part, for most of their donors, is simply not accurate anymore.
So in light of that, what do you make of end of year giving? I assume that end of year giving hasn't really been affected by this change, right? I don't know.
No, it hasn't. People don't even know. People don't even know. Like, I'll ask people that question. I'll say, when was the last time you itemized, right? They have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
Likely was the last time they itemized was 2016, and they just weren't paying attention. And they think that they're collecting their charitable receipts, right? And that's doing something. I just had this now. I was doing with my an accountant for U.S. taxes for whatever year, 2023, 2024, it doesn't matter. And they asked me about charitable deductions. I said, I'm going to give you just enough to get that universal thing up to the max. The rest I'm not even going to send you. They said, why? And I'm thinking, like, you're the accountants, like, you should know this. But okay, I didn't say that out loud because I am paying them money and I do like them. But because above that threshold, I know that I'm taking the standard deduction. So I know how much I'm giving in the US. It's below that threshold. And so, like, I don't need to share all that information with you. I'm still giving the charity because I want to give charity. Like, I'm not doing it for the tax benefit. I give money to tax benefit here, not there, because of the income effect. So that's me geeking out on the accounting of it.
Let me ask you this. If we, for whatever reason we would do this, put out a PSA and we started a multi-million-dollar publicity campaign.
Yeah. Change the timeline.
To not to change the timeline, but just to announce that this is the fact. There is a fact that, and it's been this way for what, like 10, coming up on 10 years, that you are not itemizing, and it does not matter when you give. Do you think we would see a change in behavior?
No, I don't. So the reason why it's still a thing is to go back to what you said at the beginning, which is that it's so habituated. It's so in the DNA, the culture of the time of the year, that it's not worth the effort for the most part, unless you are a unique institution that December is meaningless to you. So I'll give you an example. Synagogues. Okay. Synagogues, for the most part, are collecting the majority of their donations twice during the course of the year. When they collect dues during the high holiday season for a lot of them, or their version of dues. And when they run their gala dinner event, whenever that's going to be, it's not usually December. It's whenever it's going to be, right? It is most often unconnected to the calendar in that way. And so December, for the most part for them, unless they're doing something special and unique for the season because of the holidays or whatever it is, it doesn't have benefit. And in those cases, in many cases, when I was working campaigns, I would sometimes advise them against running up against the local whatever organization, food pantry, firehouse, who's running December, because A, you don't need to, and B, like, you're going to raise the money when you raise the money. So, like, the calendar in that case wasn't a thing. So synagogue, maybe churches are the same, I don't know. They've habituated their donors in a different way. They can try to get people to give in December, but I think they might be pushing what's possible by trying to raise money there. Now, that said, there is a lever there that does work. If somebody's doing their major gala dinner event in January and they want to get to their big donors, right? So they'll get to their big donors in December. And that makes sense because those big donors, those are the people in that very small group of people now who are still benefiting from the tax because they're going to give you 5-figure gifts or whatever they're giving us larger, right? They're making large commitments. So that makes sense from a strategic standpoint to use December as a benefit. But the other side of that, and I tell this to people all the time, is wealthy people are wealthy people. They'll be wealthy in December. They'll be wealthy in January. And so if it doesn't count for 2024, it'll count for 2025. And they're thinking about that. They are aware. And sometimes they'll tell you, you know what? I've maxed out my year. Call me next year and I'll be able to do what I did 11 months ago in the next calendar year, but I can't do it in this fiscal year. Whatever my calendar year, it isn't yours. So, so like there's a lot of, I feel like I over geeked out on this subject today, but, and maybe I have it all completely wrong. I don't. I was doing the research. I was all over Perplexity on this subject, doing all the reading about what happened. How did it change giving? Did it go down? Did it go up? Did people, how many people itemized after that? Like all that other stuff. I do wonder about changing the calendar and reimagining the calendar for people.
I'm loving this because what I find fascinating about giving is just the human behavior of it all, the human psychology of it all. And I think human psychology is at its most interesting when you identify, I don't want to say friction, but when you identify something that doesn't make sense, right? Like it's nice when things are logical. It's nice when you can map things out and say, okay, this is why people do this, this is why people do that. And then there's some like almost predictability to it. And I think this is a really good example where it doesn't really make sense anymore. It doesn't, I want to say it doesn't not make sense. There's no detriment to doing it now other than the competition of all of the noise that's out there. But certainly from the donor's perspective, there's no detriment to giving now. There's just not the incentive to give now in terms of that tax deductibility. So I find this really, really fascinating. And then it's up to, as you said, to sort of summarize, like it's up to the organization to figure out whether they want to join in all of that noise and try and cut through it and be there for their donors when their donors are habituated to giving, or when they want to say, we're gonna go elsewhere and we're going to go where there's not as much noise, and then it's going to be much easier to get attention then.
Right. I'll give you a different example also. If you had an organization that's very strongly monthly giving based, which I highly recommend if that's doable for you. So then December as a month in your monthly giving calendar isn't anything. Like you could take the month off because you're gonna get what you're gonna get that month. The income is gonna be. You might try to get a 13th gift out of people. That might be an avenue to go. Or you might look at it as a time for donor acquisition for new monthly givers. But you're not stressed in that way that you're going to have to run an end of year campaign because everybody else is running an end of year campaign. You can go to sleep that night because you don't have to stress and worry about this. This is not a thing for you, right? The other one is the organization that does their stuff in January, that's really ramping up in December. And benefiting from the fact that they're not asking in December because they're going to be asking you in January. Like the reality of it is that people give when they give, but I used to joke, like, you don't have to be the last person they give to in a calendar year. You can be the first person they give to in the next calendar year. It's just a question of how you frame that out. And so waiting to January to do a better campaign is the smarter play than trying to jam it down your throat at the end of December and compete and do a poor job just because it's the end of December, right? And so the habituated behavior is a factor, and you have to think about it. But as you said, I think sort of circling all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, ultimately is what's the best thing for your organization, and when is it best for your organization, and how have you habituated your people to give towards your cause? There's always other factors that come in. Sometimes there's an organization that is attached to a certain day of the year. So if you're a veterans organization and you're doing stuff around Veterans Day, you should be around Veterans Day or Memorial Day or things like that. Like end of December is like an add-on, but it's not the priority time of the year for you to be focusing in or driving traffic towards your giving. Or if you're doing a major event around a cancer walk around some sort of a day that's on the calendar like that, like I think you have to think about how your calendar works best for you and how your donors like respond to you. And if you then do ask in December, it might be hurting you in some cases more than it's actually helping you.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So I think it's like, it always comes down to, how, what's best for the organization. And leaning into some of these things or laying off some of these sort of habits, rituals, behaviors, I think always have to come back to, is this going to help us or actually going to hurt us?
Yeah. Yeah. I see it. I continue to see this distinction between the end of year giving and Giving Tuesday, whereas I feel like the last conversation you and I had, we sort of landed on, you don't need to participate in Giving Tuesday just to participate in Giving Tuesday. And I think the reason, again, was because that donors aren't habituated to giving then, at least not
yet,
not yet, and not an overwhelming majority. I think what makes me nervous about zigging during this time where everyone is zagging in terms of terms of end of year giving is I think people are habituated now. So I think that if you are going to evaluate whether running a big campaign during this time of year is beneficial or not for your organization, it's something I would pay more attention to than asking that same question around Giving Tuesday. I think the answer around end of year giving is much more likely to be, you know what, we really should run something now because this is when people give, as opposed to Giving Tuesday where I feel like you're just sort of joining the crowd.
Right. Let me just shift gears off of the geekdom that and lean in a little bit to your expertise here. Is so if it is a thing that you're going to do an end of calendar year campaign, so you're going to run something now-ish, let's say, right? So it's late December at this point. So what are you thinking about? What are you focused in on? Like what is it? You talked about before about the story of the organization. Like how does that work in terms of storytelling, in terms of marketing that campaign out, like the timeline for that kind of a thing from your perspective? Like, you need 3 months to think about that? Do you just know that it's an anchor in your calendar and so it fits and whenever you do it? Like, how does that go?
I like to be.
You've done like 1,000 of these, so I feel like
I've done 1,000 of them, and I've done probably 500 that have been super planned and organized, and 500 that people came to me at the last minute and said we want to do something. So I always am going to prefer column A, where people are thought out and planned, not just because it gives everyone more time, but because it's strategic, and what you're doing in February of 2025 can impact what you're doing in December of 2024. And you can sort of map out what your calendar year looks like in terms of communications. So I like when things are planned, but I know a lot of organizations just don't have that luxury of being able to think 3, 4, 5 moves ahead. So if you're at a place where you want to run an end of year campaign, I think there are ways to do it, on quickly and maybe a little bit dirtier than you otherwise would. I do think that even in any given campaign, you need to give it space. You can't just send one email to your audience and say, okay, I've done end of year giving. Great. Move on to the next thing. People do need to be reminded. They need to be asked multiple times. You need to stay top of mind. And if you haven't been in touch with your donors in 6 or 8 months, then it's much more likely to get lost. To get lost in the wind, which is why having that pre-planned calendar can be so advantageous, because then you have a structure for yourself where you're going to be in constant communication with your donors over the course of the year, so that when you go to ask them for money, it's not coming out of nowhere, and they understand the impact that they can have. So I'm always a fan of being planned and thoughtful, but when it comes to fundraising, you can do it. You can do it quickly. Just make sure that you cut through all that noise. Make sure that you stay right in front and center of people's attentions.
Do you have to try to be over the top with the storytelling to get above the noise, or does it matter because you're talking to your specific audience, let's say? Like, how does that sort of sit with you when people try to do something outlandish, or they're going to put something up, some sort of a wild video, or they're going to do something, some sort of, jump from space kind of a thing, for the sake of the campaign? Is it advantageous? Does it help? Is it like a waste of time and effort and money? Like, because you just talked about the idea that you can go sort of a little bit raw and a little dirtier with the campaign this time of the year, even though you don't recommend it. So
I think it depends what you mean by over the top. When it comes to fundraising, I am not into, this is just my like personal, largely stylistic way of approaching
yeah,
it. But I'm not into cute. I'm not into kitschy. I'm not into silly. I'm not into things that I think distract from what the need is. That is just my. I think if you're going to make an exception to that rule, it's got to be really, really well thought out. I don't mind being over the top when it comes to demonstrating the need. If you want to write something like super emotional, evocative that shows the pain points
right.
of the people that you serve and make that over the top, like I'm all for that. I think that's a great way to cut through all the noise and sort of get attention in a very, very noisy, crowded world. When it comes to the silly, that's just not my personal preference. I
Right.
tend to gravitate toward the more on the nose. Just I like to be clear. I like to be very clear when it comes to what the need is and how a donor's donation makes an impact.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear that. Yeah, you and I used to talk about videos for campaigns a lot in terms of the need or the value of them. Everyone was trying to be, what was it, the ice bucket
Yeah.
challenge, right? So, and even that one wasn't planned, right? That was like a little bit of a viral accident that raised a ton of money. And at some point, I'll geek out about that one too. But
Yeah, but
just the aftermath of that
right.
one.
But the bottom line is that if you ask people for a second example, it's very hard for most to come up
Yeah,
with the.
yeah. It is a great subject because I think there's a lot to talk about with virality and all these kinds of things. But I definitely hear your point. Like, yeah, I'm also of that mind. Like, I'll sort of add a different point. On top of being strategic and being organized and in touch with your people over the course of the year, does make asking at the end of the year um, easier, probably better, just because you're in that direction. But we freeze here? Is that a thing?
You're back now.
I'm back. Okay, great. So that wonderful. More editing work on my end. Okay, good. We'll wrap up in a couple of minutes here. But the the additional point on top of that is if it's anchored in your calendar for end of the year, and like one of the topics at some point we'll have to talk about is structuring your fundraising calendar. But if at the end of the calendar year is part of your structure, it's an anchor time when you actually ask, like the one or two times during the year, major times that you ask during the year, you know that's coming. Your donors sort of know it, but aren't paying attention to it. So they're not like on top of it. So you can direct traffic leading into that time of the year 1 month, 2 months ahead with the messaging that you're sending out, because you know that on December 15th, you're launching your end of year campaign. And maybe at some point your donors will pick up every year realizing, oh, it's coming. Most of the time they're not paying attention to that, but you can be really smart about it. And so that November 1st message that you send out is a thank you. And the November 15th message that you send out is an update. And the December 1st one is a targeted message about a donor that you have in your organization, because you're trying to plant seeds towards what you're trying to accomplish. That's like on top of being organized and strategic in terms of the calendar, is being organized, strategic about the calendar and the messaging as you're building towards your ask. So I always tell people that same thing is, if you know when it's going to be, so then you're way ahead of it. I used to joke, the way I used to teach it was, if I had the questions to the test before the test, I always knew the answers because I was prepared in advance, right? So I'm not saying that ever happened. It might have, it might not have happened at some point in high school. But the principle was really there is you have a much greater chance of success when you know something is coming and you're out in front of you. You know, if it's going to be a curveball and you've eliminated every other pitch other than a curveball, you're likely going to hit that curveball. If you listen to hitters in baseball talk about hitting, they're able to eliminate pitches. They have a much greater chance of success. And so that sort of strategy up front is like a real win. So as you said, you don't recommend sort of, on December 10th saying, you know what, maybe we should do something now and try to raise $1 million by the end of the calendar year. And I'm not saying you couldn't raise $1 million by the end of the calendar year. It's possible, although not likely. If you could be smarter, knowing in August that December is when you're going to do a next ask, then your whole Q3, Q4 period of time is way more organized and smart and strategic than it would be otherwise.
Agreed.
Okay, I think we will leave it there for today. A lot of geekdom today. Wow. Oh my gosh. Oof. Wow. Okay.
We're getting to know the real Benny.
For all those who got to the end, like, congratulations, you got through that whole thing on deductions. And if I got that wrong, so I apologize for wasting your time. But show me the tax code or whatever it is, all you accountants out there who listen to these podcasts about fundraising, to tell me how I got that completely wrong. I don't think it did, but okay. Anyway, Rami, we leave it there. Next conversation may be about the same subject, about end of year. Maybe we'll get more specific. Maybe we'll look at a couple of examples of really good campaigns or maybe even really bad campaigns that we saw, or something else. But talk to you soon.
Looking forward to it.
Bye.